recording. And just to let everybody know that this recording will be made public on our ASCM YouTube page. And I will immediately hand over to David, who was very kindly offered to launch our proceedings today. And have we lost David? Oh, no, there he is. I'm glad I'm not the only one with little gremlins in my computer.
Michael?
Yes.
Ros Hewitt asked what's happening, so I just told her that she should try again to get in, so she will probably be trying to connect as well.
Okay, yep. David, I think you're still on mute.
Right. Good evening, all. How many do we have? My screen is showing 9 faces. Are there more than that?
No, we've got 9.
Right. Well, good evening, all. We begin by acknowledging the Indigenous people of the various parts of Australia, of the land from which we are now working. Let me begin with a prayer. It's a prayer of Saint Benedict. O gracious and holy God, give us diligence to seek you, wisdom to perceive you, and patience to wait for you. Grant us, O God, a mind to meditate on you, eyes to behold you, ears to listen for your word, a heart to love you, and a life to proclaim you. Through the power of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
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 Welcome all, and especially welcome to Peter Walker. But before we talk about Peter Walker, let's just introduce to him who we are on the screen at the moment. Just a couple of sentences from each. My name is David Gill. I am a very much retired minister of the Uniting Church, and I'm speaking to you now from Manly in New South Wales. Going around the screen, Michael, tell us who you are, please.
So yes, Michael Mitchell, based currently in Albury, and I'm actually using my university office at Charles Sturt University. I have got permission. But yes, I'm currently a research fellow here, working on a project in Pakistan.
Mandy?
Mandy Tibby, barrister, Anglican, helping the ASCM in strengthening itself as a senior friend of the ASCM, also involved with the New South Wales Ecumenical Council as an Anglican. And we enjoyed your talk last year, Peter. Thank you. And I knew your father, and he was wonderful.
Still is.
Great.
John.
Me.
John Bretz.
Good afternoon. Yes, John Bretz. I'm an Anglican deacon. I'm an engineering manager as my day job. I'm also the convener of SCM Queensland, and it's my first time on, so I'm glad that the technical glitch was not at my end.
Welcome. Robbie.
Robbie Tulip. I'm Director of Communications and Partnership for ASCM and Secretary of Canberra Region Presbytery of the Uniting Church.
We will bypass Peter Walker for the moment. And there's Andrew Bernard, long time no see. Andrew, tell us about you.
Hi, everyone. Yes, SCM from many, many years ago, and still keeping in touch with a few of the faces around the screen, some of whom I haven't seen for a little while, David, but it's lovely to see you again. And Peter, of course, may remember me from some years ago.
Well, Andrew, it's so good to see you. Yeah.
So yes, Peter was the minister at Paddington, where I was some years ago. Yeah, so this is the first time I've been on this session, so I'm looking forward to it.
Welcome again. Mark.
Hi folks, I'm a Uniting Church minister and I work for the Synod of New South Wales and ACT across the whole state, mostly in rural and remote and struggling coastal presbyteries.
Right. And Dan Etherington, sorry.
You're still on mute, Dan.
Can you unmute that? Just press the little, there it is.
Yeah, no, I know what to do. I just,
Yeah, we can hear you.
we are retired. We are members of the Uniting Church at Kipax. Dan and Maureen.
Welcome. Marion, tell us who you are. You're muted, by the way, Marion, you are muted.
So I am, not now. Hello, I'm Marion. I was an STM staff worker in the 1980s, and then I've been an academic for most of the intervening years, and I live on Gadigal land in Sydney.
And Ros Hewitt, anonymous, but she's somewhere there. Yes, Ros.
Ros, this is Andika. He's the National Treasurer and I'm a senior friend. We live in Canberra, and we'll be a little bit in and out because we moved house this week, so we're on the way to finishing our old place, but we thought we'd join quickly and say hello.
Great. Well, welcome all, and welcome especially Peter Walker. Let me tell you a few things about Peter. He is a minister of the gospel, currently serving within the Uniting Church in Australia. He has studied at the University of New South Wales, McGill University in Canberra, in Canada, and Charles Sturt University. He is the principal of the United Theological College in Sydney. In fact, Peter, I think you arrived at about the same time as COVID. Would that be right? Yes?
I don't think there's a causal link, but you are correct, David. Yeah.
So he's still quite a fresh principal of a theological college. His academic interests, as far as I can make out from the blurb that he gets in the website of UTC, his academic interests are a mixture of church history and theology. What would you call yourself, Peter? A church historian, a theologian, or a happy mixture of both?
Happy mixture of both sounds good, David. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, that sounds like a good background for someone to talk about the confusion we're in as a society on all things political. Part of the mix that we are coping with at the moment is the emphasis on what's called identity politics, which raises, first of all, the question, what the hell is identity politics? And then this further question, how does this relate to the Christian faith itself? Can you enlighten us on this?
Well, David, thanks so much for that nice introduction, and it's really lovely to be with you all. Good to see some friends, David, Andrew, colleague Mark, and some people who I've met in different spaces, and people who I know of, like Marion. Lovely to meet you, Marion, in this way. I approach this conversation as a theologian. I think that's probably the general sort of term I'd use for myself, David, and not an expert in politics or identity politics, but rather someone who's interested to think about what's happening before us from a theological perspective. And so I was really, really pleased. Thank you, David, and thank you to whoever came up with the idea to invite me to come and be with you. A little bit of personal background is I was a university chaplain for several years when I was first ordained at University Chaplain in Sydney. So I have special memories of being involved with various campus movements, the SCM, and if I might make an assumption, at that time had a fair bit to do with Jim Tulip. So I just mentioned that for various people's sake, but perhaps especially for Robbie's. So thanks for having me. And I've called this little reflection, The Gospel and Identity Politics. And I'm probably going to speak for about 25 or 30 minutes, hopefully with something in there of interest. And then I'm guessing we'll have a conversation thereafter. And I've got a screen to share if that's okay, Michael. And I'll just have a go at that, assuming I might have permission to do that, and we'll see what happens. Great. I'm guessing you might hopefully be seeing something that looks a bit like a screen share. Good. And let me just minimize this out of the way so I can do what I need to do. Great. Forgive me while I keep playing with what I've got here so everything's sorted out. And I should ask, just to be sure, everyone hearing me okay?
Yep,
Good.
you're sounding
Yes.
Very
fine.
good. Or even too loud? No. Okay, so what I'm going to do, spend this little bit of time talking about is just my own very general, and as I say, as not as a specialist, but just as a person like you, someone thinking about what we're seeing and reading of in the news, say a few words about identity politics. And then what that led me to do about a year ago is be thinking about the identity politics of a different form that we find in Jesus's day in what would be called the purity system. So I'll say a few words about the purity system, then a little bit of a reflection on the alternative social vision of the gospel, and then finish with the kind of astonishing vision of equality in Galatians chapter 3. So there are a few slides along the way, and I'll click through those so you won't see much of my face, which might be helpful. You'll see some slides, and I'm told that helps people even if the talk's a little bit boring. There's interesting things to look at. So let's launch into the gospel and identity politics. I'm going to generalize, and I'm looking forward to the reflections of others when we get to the discussion, particularly people who may know this better than me. Generally speaking, 20th century politics in the West was organised by and large along a left-right spectrum defined by economic issues. Left-wing or reforming political movements were centred on workers, trade unions, and were championed by socialist or social democratic movements and parties seeking better worker protections and a fairer distribution of wealth. That's the left. Right-wing or politically conservative movements were focused on promoting private enterprise, reducing the reach of government, and on promoting the benefits to the economy and to individuals of freeing the commercial sector from regulation, free markets and free enterprise. But in the last, say, 10 to 15 and perhaps 20 years, that left-right political spectrum based on economic concerns seems to have given way. Political energy now gathers around what some have come to call identity politics. So among the more interesting political twists of the last 5 years or so were the two big electoral surprises of 2016. Britain's vote to leave the European Union, Brexit, and the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. They were outcomes that make little sense if viewed through an economic lens. And rather, the political messaging and the political skirmishes about identity in those elections was absolutely central to their outcomes. Who are we and who are we not? Who is one of us and who is not? Who should be in and who should be out? Both Brexit and the Trump election focused on immigration, on national and community identity, on borders, on sovereignty, on who is in, who is one of us, and who is out because they're not. So Trump's wall on the Mexican border came to kind of be the, you know, the symbol par excellence of that identity in and out kind of politics, along with his travel ban soon after his election against travel from certain Muslim majority countries. So I recently began to ponder where this phenomena of identity politics comes from. And as I say, doing that simply as an interested observer. This is what I come up with anyway. From the, beg your pardon, let's get that back where it was. From around the 1960s, left-wing politics began to focus less on economic equality, that left-right economic spectrum, less on the workers, not to say it didn't continue that focus, but less so, and more on advocacy for marginalised groups. Think of the movement for the rights of women, for civil rights, for the rights of Indigenous people, refugees, gay and lesbian people. In response, right-wing politics began redefining itself in the direction of nationalism. In particular, it seems to me, the right began redefining itself as the patriots. Or put another way, politics from the right became more focused on protecting a particular form of traditional national identity, an identity that was and is typically narrowly and selectively defined. And the right began doing that in response to what it perceived to be an undermining of who we are, of that national identity, that almost sacred national identity, by the advocacy that had begun from the left for the rights and liberties of those who were allowed no space in that national identity, or were only allowed a marginalised space in that narrowly defined who we are. Right-wing politics, to me, seems to have been making the most ground out of the identity wars. So think of Erdogan in Turkey, Modi in India, Netanyahu now gone, but replaced by similar characters in Israel, Putin in Russia, Trump in the US, now gone, but still very much active. The left of politics did its best work in the 60s and 70s when the politics of identity first emerged for them around the need to provide an identity for those who'd previously been denied it. For a still, I think, contemporary example in Australia for how this breakdown of the old left-right spectrum on economics issues has moved to the politics of identity. For a contemporary example, I think still relevant in Australia, think of how Pauline Hanson, very much of the right, attracts support for her very crass and very conservative vision of a white Christian Australia, even from those whose economic vulnerability would lead you to think that instead of being attracted to conservative politics, they would be attracted to the left of politics. The workers of Queensland seem to be among Pauline Hanson's greatest fans. Think also of how right-wing politics in Australia has sold itself as the protector of national identity, the patriots in the so-called illegal arrivals debate. This is where I will defer to at least one other person among us substantially. Remember, we will decide who comes to Australia and the circumstances in which they come, from Prime Minister Howard. Manus and Nauru have been a battle not over injustice against refugees or human rights, but really a battle over borders and national identity. I think it's worth saying that probably both left and right, if that simplification stands, are implicated in the present kind of downward spiral into identity politics. Politics is becoming fractured, it seems to me, into a cycle of resentment. Populist leaders identify themselves with particular groups and stoke those fires of resentment. I suspect the genius, and you might even say the evil genius of the Trump machine, was and still is located in its ability to tap into the politics of grievance and resentment among particular identity groups in the US. Trump has created a contest over who can claim to be marginalised in the nation, and seemingly unbelievably has whipped those from his white Christian base into the feeling that they are the marginalised. But let me just not move on without saying the following. There is a tradition going back as far, at least as far as Karl Marx, that sees political struggles as a manifestation of economic struggles. And I, for one, think we should never write off the reality of that reading of society. As we speak, the 26 wealthiest individuals on the planet control the same wealth as the entire bottom 50% of the global population. And it's worth taking a moment to just try and digest those statistics. The increase in global trade over the last 30 years has produced astonishing economic growth and wealth creation, and it has also led to an equally astonishing disparity between those who benefit from that growth and those who do not. Whole populations of people seem to be left behind. But nevertheless, and notwithstanding that little statement about the ongoing relevance of political action against economic injustice, I think it's identity politics that seems to claim a hold upon us at the moment. So, witnessing these last few years led me to think about the purity system of the Jewish world of Jesus' day. And identity, in a way, at a different time. Interestingly, identity politics is a relatively recent term, arriving into common use in the 1990s. But the prejudice on which it feeds, who is in and who is out, goes deep into human history. So I'd like to take us back 2,000 years just to discuss a form of identity politics that will be familiar to you, but I'm going to describe perhaps in a slightly different way. Scholars call it a purity system. Purity systems are found in most cultures. We don't stop often enough to register how they operate among us all the time. And perhaps you might bring to mind some contemporary parallels while I'm speaking about the first century. At a high level of abstraction, purity systems are systems of classification, lines and boundaries around people and groups. A purity system is a cultural map, if you like, that indicates which people and practices belong within the dominant culture and which do not. And among those that do belong, where they belong. I suspect among the most obvious expressions of a purity system today is still the prejudice around human sexuality. Adding a little more detail, a purity system is a social system organized around the contrasts between pure and impure, clean and unclean. These classifications of pure or impure, clean or unclean can apply to people, to places, to things, to times, and to social groups. The purity system of the first century Jewish world, the world in which Jesus lived, took Leviticus 9:2 as its basis. Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for the Lord, I, the Lord your God, am holy. And Leviticus then sets out Israel's holiness code and purity laws, which define holiness and therefore godliness. And they're found in Leviticus chapters 11 to 16 and then 17 to 26. Most important for our purposes is the way in which pure and impure is applied on a spectrum in first century Judaism to people and social groups. A person's purity status depended to some extent on their birth. In particular, there is an order of purity from priests, followed by Israelites, and followed by Jewish persons who were not Jewish by birth, that is to say, converts. But purity or impurity depended not only on birth, but might also depend on behaviour. Those who behaved in such a way as to be carefully observant of the Levitical codes were pure. Those who were non-observant were impure. The impure also included certain occupational groups. The great intrigue aroused in Jericho when Jesus visited the house of Zacchaeus, who is named the chief tax collector of the town, is an example. It was Jesus's breach of the purity codes that caused the scandal. Tax collectors were impure. And this connection between being a tax collector and being impure is highlighted by the different ways that Luke and Matthew offer us the same portion of the Sermon on the Mount in their two different renderings of that event. In Luke 6:32, we read, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. But Matthew takes the same portion of the sermon and renders it this way. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even tax collectors do the same? The purity system is also this matrix of classification within which we find the social meaning in the first century of the two terms, the righteous and the sinners. The righteous were those who followed the purity codes. The sinners were those who did not. Although I'll just pause and say, we need to be careful in thinking about the range of meanings of sin and sinner in first century Judaism, because our way of thinking about sin as a kind of series of misdemeanors is well off the mark. A person's standing place vis-a-vis God and the law were their relationship, and sin was a relational concept much more. So some examples of the classification of pure and impure are worth just naming. Jews and Gentiles. These will all be familiar to you, I imagine. Being Jewish did not guarantee one's purity, but by definition, all Gentiles were impure and unclean. Men and women. In the same way, being male did not guarantee purity, nor did being female by definition make a person impure, but the natural processes of menstruation and childbirth were considered sources of impurity and had led to the general marginalisation of women as impure. able-bodied and disabled. Physical wholeness was associated with purity and physical disability with impurity. So the chronically ill, the maimed, those with leprosy were on the impure side of the spectrum. Rich and poor. Again, poverty did not make a person impure, but the fact that this will have made it tremendously difficult, if not impossible, to meet the purity codes and their expectations of temple taxation led to the impurity of the poor. So let's turn, as it were, to Jesus's challenge to the identity politics of his day. Those familiar with the Gospels will know that Jesus is frequently found to be portrayed in conflict with the religious authorities, particularly, but not only those known as the Pharisees. The Pharisees were, if we've understood them at all, a group who sought the extension and enforcement, might be the right word, enforcement of the purity codes. And I say conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees and wonder if that is too strong. But let me give you one example of how strong that conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees seems to have been. Here I'm reading from Luke 11:43 to 44, and I'll just explain this to you. Woe to you, Pharisees, for you love to have a seat of honor in the synagogues and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces. Woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without realizing it. Now, that Jesus names the Pharisees as unmarked graves can easily be misunderstood. First instincts lead us to think he's saying something powerful, which he is not. First instincts can lead us to think that Jesus is saying it would be better off if you Pharisees were dead. A strong statement. But understanding this statement correctly reveals how strong it is in a different way and how stunning is the criticism it contains. In the Levitical codes setting out the pure and the impure, death is proclaimed as a source of impurity. Coming into contact with the dead made you impure. The Pharisees were those who sought the enforcement of the purity codes. Yet here Jesus names them as unmarked graves, over which people innocently walk over the dead and become impure without knowing that they're contacting impurity. Jesus names the Pharisees as the impure, the enforcers of purity as a source of impurity. Jesus's radical vision of change, his radical social vision, could not have been more different or more telling in this context of Israel's purity codes. Listen again to the capstone verse of the Levitical codes known to all Jews of the first century. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. But listen to the intentional contrast that Jesus draws to that verse in his Sermon on the Plain, as it's called in Luke, but that's Luke's portrayal of the Sermon on the Mount. In the Sermon on the Plain, Luke 6:32, and I'm shortening a longer section here just to capture the source, the essence of it. Jesus says, love your enemies, do good, lend, expect nothing in return, be merciful as your Father is merciful. Holy, merciful. The purity system of the first century Jewish world was a social system centered on holiness, on classifying those who are pure and those who are impure, those who belong and those who do not, those who are us and those who are them. Not much has changed in 2000 years. during last century and up until the 1960s, political concern with identity had largely been, during the 60s and 70s, political concern with identity had largely been the province of those who wanted to actualize the rights of individuals who had otherwise been forced into marginalization. A noble thing. It was an inevitable response to injustice by those who wanted justice. But identity politics became problematic when it turned us and them into us or them. So the world worries us. The politics of identity worries me. And I think we need also to be honest and vigilant about naming the purity systems that are still at work among us. We would also need to be honest and say that the church plays identity politics. And whenever we do that, we simply replicate the political dysfunction that we see in the nightly news. The Christian presence in the world, when it descends into that kind of identity game of us and them, is nothing more than a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And it loses sight of Jesus's radical substitution of an ethic of mercy for an ethic of holiness. Or am I putting that rightly? Not so much a substitution, but a reconfiguration of what holiness means. When we recognize ourselves as a community of Christ's disciples, and that we seek to follow him as a truly astonishing prophet of equality, hopefully we can become freed from the identity games, both in church and world. There is no more us or them, and there's not even us and them. There is hopefully only we in him, which was actually the vision, the alternative social vision of the earliest church. The alternative social vision of Jesus centered on what he called the kingdom of God, taken up in some of the earliest Christian communities. And here, having talked for too long already, I'll finish by highlighting this astonishing statement from Galatians chapter 3, which speaks with such great power. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male or female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. It's a message that I think can help, or helped me, in thinking about identity politics, purity systems, and what it means to be a Christian that seeks to proclaim a different vision. I think it's a message that is as much, if not more than, relevant to us today as when it was first written. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. So that's my ponderings on the gospel and identity politics. Naive as much as it was, hopefully it gives people the chance for a conversation. David.
If that is naivete, then let's have a lot more of it. Now we have a chance to interact with questions, comments. Over to you, folks. Don't forget to unmute yourself before you speak. Marion, you look as if you're breathless with anticipation.
I'd really love to hear what Marion would like to correct, or otherwise.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I found that really interesting, and I would just like some further clarification. I was really still unsure by the end of your presentation I really appreciated your taking us the parallel between identity politics and purity systems, but I wasn't quite sure what actually identity politics in the current environment, what was encompassed by an identity politics for now. So I was thinking about when you were talking about Trump, and you were saying that the division used to be between the left and right on economic grounds, and you sort of implied that that had faded away. But we actually know that to be a Trump voter, Trump's voters were not the poor and downtrodden. Trump voters have higher than average incomes, and it was there's a reason why he's the Republican. What was with the Republican Party? It's he's there to serve the interests of billionaires, and that's what he did. So it's you gave the example of Pauline Hanson as the Australian example, but she draws only a very tiny proportion of the vote. So I was like, they have I was not quite sure that where the relationship between identity and economic divisions falls in the current environment. And the same with Brexit. I mean, is Brexit really about, I mean, identity and immigration and those things were sort of the pretext, but who was actually pushing it? It was the economic right pushing it for, I would have thought, fairly old-fashioned economic right reasons. So I was thinking about just one quick example before I shut up. The news that we've just had in the last few days about the heartbeat legislation in Texas banning abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy. Well, I didn't even know I was pregnant with either of my children after 6 weeks. And not only banning abortion, but soliciting people to dob in anybody who tries to get an abortion, tries to raise money for a loan to travel interstate to get an abortion, hires an Uber to get interstate to get an abortion. All those people can be given $10,000 if they dob someone in for doing any of those things. So that's really bringing that's a gender equality issue, a women's health issue. And as abortion has always been, it's going to hit the poorest people the hardest, and offering bribes to people to dob in anyone who tries to get around the law is just bringing the economic aspect of it far, far more into relief than is normally the case. So I was just sort of reflecting on how identity issues are important because they tie into economic issues. Like gender is important because we have a gender pay gap. Indigenous rights are important because Indigenous people are the most economically deprived and have the worst health outcomes and are the most incarcerated people in the country, and have and all that is because they have had their land stolen, which is the economic base of any society. So I just, I'm just going to stop now.
Oh, but I find that so interesting, Marion, and helped by it. And maybe it's better to say this. It's interesting that politics is still perhaps driven by the economic, but it seems to me that the identity stuff has become the front in some ways for those continuing drivers. And maybe I overstated, which I didn't intend to do, which is to say that again, very, very bluntly and naively set that old spectrum of left to right economic concerns of, say, the first half of last century has faded a bit, and identity politics come to the fore, however we understand that. And I think you're saying better than I am, which is that those issues around identity are still actually sort of driven in behind by the economic. But I've got this, and this is a question as much as anything, it just this sense of whether I'm right or wrong, but that, for example, Trump seems to attract people to conservative politics who you would think otherwise you'd associate with people being driven towards toward the left. But you're naming there that, you know, we know that most of his voters are in a higher, above average income earners.
Well, almost the only demographic that actually stayed with Trump through the entire period of his presidency from before 2016 through to now are actually white evangelicals. 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that statistic, and that figure has pretty much stayed stable. And they tend to be of in across the board of a higher income bracket, but his real support, his real kind of who's running the campaigns and pushing for him to be re-elected and to run again, and who's been running the Stop the Steal campaigns and all those things, his force comes from the very
super rich. And I guess this is my question is, but are those 80% of white evangelical Christians voting for him because they like the idea that he's giving, because they like his economic policies, you know, tax breaks for the super rich, or are they voting for him because he speaks to their identity, he provokes a kind of a sense of identity for them around their, you know, abortion and immigration and Supreme Court and those sorts of things?
It's an interesting question.
Yeah.
There's a very significant study by Andrew Whitehead, Samuel Perry, and someone else whose name I can't remember, that says that the best predictor of voting for Trump in 2016 was not actually going to church, but it was subscribing to a set of ideas that they call Christian nationalism, which is believing a set of things about the nature of America as being divinely instituted and there to kind of wreak vengeance on the rest of the world, like the sort of blood and thunder aspects of Christian nationalism. So there is that kind of, but why do those people hold those things? Is it because they feel like feminism and black rights have gone too far? To some degree, yes, I think there is that kind of sense of reaction against of society that those people feel has changed too fast. And to some degree, it is a reaction to a sense of kind of economic security or economic privilege under threat. It's I think the research on that is still in progress.
Thanks
from what I've seen.
Let me intervene for a moment to say welcome to Chris Emery, who joined us at some point throughout the presentation. Other comments or questions that people would like to offer?
I'd like to pick up on the theme of the relationship between Christianity and identity politics, and I think that this conversation with Marion has raised something of a paradox, that in the broader society, the sort of Christian nationalism that Marion was describing is perceived as Christianity. And so people tend not to be aware of the sort of Galatians text or Amos 5, let justice roll, those sorts of texts where the old purity ethos of Judaism was saying, you know, I despise your feasts, but focus on justice. Now that's a sort of biblical vision of Christian identity, but it's not how Christianity is perceived. Like, Christianity is perceived through this lens of nationalism as a right-wing tribal identity. And I think that that's something that really creates problems for an organisation like the Student Christian Movement, because students who have grown up, I suppose, with a progressive sense of identity politics are really just quite hostile to religion as such, like they perceive Christianity through this lens of identity politics as something that is hostile towards justice.
Let's collect a few comments. I see Mandy was wanting to buy in, and then John Retz has his hand up. Mandy?
Yes, I found Marion's comments fascinating because I think the media has perhaps snowed us all into thinking that those who supported Trump and supported Brexit were more the working people. And that, of course, is particularly put about by the Murdoch press, really. Yep. But when you actually analyse it, and Elizabeth Warren has, Senator Elizabeth Warren's written a couple of books on this, exactly as Marion said, that it's the uber wealthy who have supported Donald Trump massively. In terms of, so that was very helpful, Marion, and I think we've all been snowed, frankly. But just thinking about identity politics and Christianity, of course, I think, Peter, you're absolutely spot on that the Christian message helps us to cut through to people, accepting and enjoying people as people, and that being something that the generosity of God requires of us, and that's really the message of the gospel, beyond our particular identities. But along the way, because the marginalised are the marginalised have felt the need to organise in silos, really. So at the moment, you know, it's LGBTI, it's the Black Lives Matter and the Green Movement and so on. So there are all these silos. And that's good because I think that's really just a continuation of the previous civil rights movement, the feminist movement in the Me Too movement and so on. Where it can possibly become toxic is the so-called cancel culture, perhaps, where if you have any different view from me, you must be wrong and I won't hear you. And social media seems to be making it too easy to switch off to anyone who has a different view and to lampoon them. So I guess an ethic of respect for all other people, beyond the aspects of our identities, which are usually multiple. We don't all just have one-dimensional identities. Most of us would hope that we are full and rounded and whole people with many aspects to our multiple identities. So just some thoughts around that. But I agree that the Galatians vision of what the Christian message is all about is very liberating and helpful. But I think we're still in that stage of, along the way, those marginalised groups really feeling a need to stake out some ground. And of course, that provokes a counter reaction.
Thanks. John, and then we'll give Peter a chance to respond.
Peter, I thought I'd just invite your response or reaction from the historian in you and say, or ask the question, does some of this go back to unfinished business in what we call the Second World War? And why I ask that, obviously a lot of values were thrown in the air by the war to end all wars, and one side didn't agree and they went in for chapter 2. I'm no Mark Blythe, but yeah, I did sit at a barbecue once with someone from the UK, and the sense that Brexit was a possibility was real to me, because basically, though this person had become a technician, he found nothing in the UK worth staying for and has migrated to Australia. He has high-level technical abilities, very high-level technical abilities, I assure you. His father was in the post office. His father fought in the war. His father was, against his will, pretty well go back to Korea now. And there's sort of like, you know, we won the war, but look at us now type thing. On the other hand, you had the beginning of all these affirmations of the silos Mandy mentions, like you have the American black fighter pilots, as they were known, the female ferry pilots, etc., etc. Did, say, America and its allies, you feel, getting ported over to conscripted to deal with the Cold War, did that leave too much unfinished business, even at the level of Christian values that my grandparents took into that conflict?
Peter, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks,
comment?
David. I'm almost inclined to ask John what he, not to dodge, but what your sense of the answer to that is. This will sound like a dodge, but I'm just curious.
I do have a sense there's unfinished business. I have a sense that all too quickly people, what would you call it? The common we were shaking hands in Berlin, and then it was subdivided into 4 quarters in short order, and then there was this massive standoff. I just get a sense that that there's a sense of unfinished business that's acted as in
Brexit in particular, in Europe and
my personal anecdote goes back to Brexit, but then I look at some of the other things, like why weren't the Americans in the 60s and 70s, having as many, African American airline pilots flying between states as you would have seen or expected on projection out of World War II, for example. So there are a lot of things opened up that we sort of went back again, like stalled out for the late 40s, 50s, and then you see them come forth in the 70s. And then what does that mean for us and our values? Were we just becoming like caught up in foreign policy realism and going, we've still got someone making statements, or are we values driven?
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm very interested by your observations there. I think my answer would be just simply to say two things that I think strike me in this are the astonishing degree in which international migration across the globe has increased in the period of time that you're talking about, and the extent to which the phenomenal increase in wealth and the disparity between where that wealth is located drive a lot of discontent, rightly or wrongly.
Yes.
So whether it's unfinished business since the war, or the fact that the incredible intermingling of people across the globe and difference, and how people cope with that difference, and the grievances around wealth and poverty are pretty significant, I think.
Yeah, and in my personal example, the thing I used was the son had progressed further economically than the father, but felt more disconnected from, in this case, the British community.
I see that Ros has her hand up, and then we'll give Peter a chance to respond. And I think, in fairness to Peter, we should wind it up at that point, if that's okay with everyone, right? Okay, Ros, unmute yourself and we're all yours.
Thanks, Peter, for a really interesting presentation. We were listening in the background and nodding and going, oh, well, this is really interesting, context for us. Can everyone hear me?
Yep. Not very well.
Sorry, I'll Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, yep. Sorry, I just said, Peter, thank you for a really interesting presentation. We were listening in the background, nodding our heads, going, oh, it's really good context. So a couple of comments. The first is probably a little bit of a question as well. And so I work in Parliament, and we're surrounded by politics all the time, although I don't work in politics, I'm a researcher. But one of the ideas, I suppose, floating around Parliament of those of us who work in the building across parliaments and across parties is that Australia will never degenerate politically into a country that's riven by identity politics, because we have compulsory voting. So in essence, the major parties, the parties that will
win elections never have to appeal to a bit of a crazy base. They have to appeal to the sensible centre. Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure. I'd be interested to hear your opinion, Peter, and I suppose anyone else. And the other comment I had was just thinking of a non-Western example. So my PhD was on Indonesian history, and particularly on the history of people of European descent there. And as part of it, I researched the history of government policies towards ethnic minorities. And one of the most fascinating things about the Suharto era was he was so terrified of identity politics that all discussion of, sorry, I'm just trying to think of the acronym, of class, religion, race, and ethnicity was completely forbidden, because he was so worried that
in Indonesia.
Yes, because he was so worried that that any discussion of those four particular things would lead to groups coalescing and essentially coming together and toppling him. So that's just a non-Western example that comes to mind. I mean, in the end, you know, he was toppled for economic reasons, actually, because of a economic crisis. So caught up with him in the end anyway. But yeah, just a comment there. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll take that second as a comment from someone who knows more about Indonesia than me, that's for sure. But it's interesting, isn't it, that the desire to quell religion, gender, those sorts of issues as being divisive is indicative in itself. On the question of compulsory voting, I'll just make this observation. I thought it was so interesting that when President Obama visited Australia, and I'm thinking that's probably in the 2012, 2013 or whenever that was, someone will remember, and he'd had a nice visit all the way around Australia, and he was getting on Air Force One to head home, and as it were, the last question from the lucky reporter who got to ask the last question was, what is it about Australia that you would most like to take home with you to the United States? Thinking he might say, something very Australian like
Vegemite.
Vegemite. Thank you, David. But what Barack Obama said, what he would most like to take home is compulsory voting. That was his comment. The thing he would most like to take from Australia to the United States is compulsory voting. So I think it's right. We have it is a treasure.
Thank you, one and all, and especially thank you, Peter. You have helped us understand our world a little better, and in the process, you have helped us hear the gospel once again. Thank you,
David, and thank you all for having me. Thank you. Yeah.
Before everyone switches off, Mandy, would you like to tell us what is in store? When is the next online lecture, webinar?
The next one is Sunday the 19th, and it will be Marion. So Marion, would you like to talk about what you will be talking about, please?
You're being muted.
There we are. I'm going to talk about religion and Australian politics.
Right. That will follow on beautifully from this one. And then the one after that is on the 26th of September, and that is entitled The Spirit of St. Francis is Alive and Well, looking at the Christian journeys of some Anglican Franciscans and why Francis is important to them.
Right.
Sounds good. Very diverse. The Australian student Christian movement at its absolute best. Thank you, one. Thank you all. The Lord be with you.
And also
with you.
Yes.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.